Nobody stood up to the rude businessman until the waitress mocked him to his face. Richard Blackwell was used to the respectful silence his presence commanded at the Golden Terrace, the most elegant restaurant in Chicago. At 62, the construction tycoon had built an empire based on fear and intimidation of everyone who worked for him. It was on a typical Thursday that everything changed forever. Richard had just publicly humiliated Dorothy, a 68-year-old cleaning lady who had spilled a few drops of water on the floor near his table. The cruel words he hurled at the elderly woman sent tears streaming down her wrinkled face, while the other patrons pretended not to see the embarrassing scene. "You have no right to treat anyone like that," came a firm voice behind him. Richard slowly turned in his chair, incredulous. Who would dare challenge him? His eyes met those of Emma Sullivan, a 24-year-old waitress who had worked there for only 3 months. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders as she held a coffee carafe with slightly trembling hands. "Excuse me." Richard arched an eyebrow, his voice dripping with disdain. "Dorothy didn't do anything wrong. A few drops of water on the floor don't justify you yelling at her like that," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The entire restaurant fell dead silent. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. Richard rose slowly, his imposing stature casting a shadow over the young waitress. "Little girl, you don't know who you're talking to," he said, jabbing a finger at her. "I can ruin your career in 5 minutes." Emma took a step forward, moving even closer to his table. "And you don't know who you're dealing with either," she shot back, raising the coffee carafe. Before Richard could react, the dark, scalding liquid poured directly over his head, drenching his perfectly styled grey hair and dripping down his $3,000 Italian suit. The shock left him frozen for a few seconds, feeling only the hot coffee trickling down his face. You've lost your mind," he shouted, wiping his face with his hands. "No more than someone who thinks they can step on others just because they have money," Emma retorted, slamming the empty carafe onto the table with a sharp clink. At that moment, Marcus Reynolds, the restaurant manager, rushed over, his face pale with nerves. At 45, he had worked there for 15 years and had never witnessed anything like this. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm so sorry," Marcus stammered. "Emma, you're fired. Get out right now." "Easy, Marcus," Richard said, surprising everyone with his relatively controlled tone as he peeled off his soaked jacket. "Let me talk to the young lady first. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, back to the story." Emma crossed her arms, waiting. Other diners began whispering among themselves, some discreetly snapping photos with their phones. Richard grabbed a napkin and kept drying himself, his eyes never leaving the young woman's determined face. "What's your full name?" he asked. "Emma Sullivan Parker," she answered without hesitation. "And how long have you worked here, Emma?" 3 months. Richard nodded slowly, as if processing the information. "And in 3 months, how many times have you seen me mistreat the staff?" The question caught Emma off guard. She had expected shouting, threats, maybe even him calling security. She hadn't expected a conversation. "Many times," she admitted. "I saw you make Dorothy cry today. Last week it was the waiter, Ryan, because he took 2 minutes to bring the water. Before that, it was the receptionist, because she didn't know the name of the wine you wanted." "You've been watching me very closely," Richard commented, a strange smile forming on his lips. "Someone has to. No one else dares to say a word." "And you do?" "Apparently, yes." Marcus was still nervous, shifting his gaze between the two. Some employees had discreetly moved closer, including Dorothy, who was still dabbing her tears with a tissue. "Emma, do you know who I am?" Richard asked, finally finishing drying himself off. "I know you own several construction companies in the city. I know people are afraid of you. And I know you use that fear to mistreat those who can't defend themselves." Richard laughed, a humorless sound. "Very good. And do you think throwing coffee on my head will change anything?" "I don't know. But at least now you know how it feels to be humiliated in front of everyone." The comment hit Richard like a punch to the gut. For a moment his face hardened, and Emma thought he'd finally explode. But then he did something no one expected. He sat back down in his chair and motioned for Marcus to come closer. "Bring me a clean shirt from my office," he told the manager, "and prepare my usual table for tomorrow at the same time." "Sir," Marcus blinked, confused. "You heard me." "And Marcus, the waitress isn't fired." "But Mr. Blackwell—" "She's not fired," Richard repeated, this time more firmly. "In fact, I want her to be the one to serve me every time I come here." Emma felt her legs tremble slightly. This wasn't going how she'd expected. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter than she'd intended. Richard stood again, picked up his leather briefcase and looked her straight in the eyes. "Because, young lady, in 62 years of life, you're the first person who's had the guts to stand up to me. And that's made me curious to know what kind of person does something like that." He started walking toward the exit but stopped and turned one last time. "Oh, and Emma, next time you want to humiliate me, use hotter coffee." This one was lukewarm. After he left, the restaurant erupted in chatter. Emma stood there, still processing what had just happened. Dorothy approached and gently touched her arm. "Sweetheart, you don't know what you've done," the elderly woman whispered. "That man is capable of anything when he's angry." "He didn't seem angry," Emma murmured, more to herself. "Worse," Marcus said, shaking his head as he stepped closer. "When Richard Blackwell stays calm like that, it's because he's planning something. You must be out of your mind to have done that." Emma looked around, seeing the worried expressions on all her co-workers' faces. Maybe she really had lost her senses. But when she saw the smile on Dorothy's lips, she knew she'd done the right thing. That night, Emma arrived home at the small apartment she shared with her mother, Ellen, in the Bridgeport neighborhood. Ellen Sullivan, 58, worked as a nursing assistant at a public hospital and always came home exhausted from her night shifts. "How was work today, honey?" Ellen asked, preparing a simple dinner in the tiny kitchen. "Something strange happened, Mom," Emma said, sitting at the kitchen table. "Remember that rude businessman I always complain about? The one who treats everyone at the restaurant badly?" Ellen stopped stirring the beans and turned around. "That Richard, what's his name? Richard Blackwell. Today I threw coffee on him." "You did what?" Emma told her mother the whole story, who alternated between expressions of pride and worry. When it was over, Ellen sat beside her daughter. "Emma, that man is dangerous. You don't know the things he's done to people who challenged him." "What kind of things?" Ellen hesitated for a moment, nervously fidgeting with her hands. "About 15 years ago, I worked as a cleaning assistant in one of his company's buildings. It was just a part-time job to make ends meet. Richard Blackwell would show up now and then to inspect the construction. And what happened? He yelled at everyone, humiliated the workers in front of others. Once he made a bricklayer redo a wall 3 times because he said it was crooked when it wasn't. The man worked 2 straight days without stopping just to prove he could do it Richard's way." Emma listened silently, a strange feeling growing in her stomach. "And you never told me this?" "Why would I, honey? He was just another bad boss. Life's hard enough without dwelling on those things," Ellen sighed. "But when you started working at that restaurant and mentioned him, I got worried." "Why?" "Because you're just like your father. You can't see injustice without doing something about it." Emma smiled sadly. Her father, Mike Sullivan, had passed away in a work accident when she was only 16. He worked as a welder and always refused to accept unsafe conditions, even if it meant losing his job. "Dad would have done the same thing I did today," she said. "Yes, he would, and look how he ended up." Her mother's words brought a heavy sadness to Emma's heart. Mike had stood up to a supervisor who demanded he work without proper safety gear. When he refused, he was fired. 2 weeks later, he got a job at another company, but the safety equipment they provided was faulty. The accident that took his life could have been prevented. "Mom, sometimes we have to stand up to people like that. If no one speaks out, they'll keep hurting others forever." Ellen looked at her daughter with a mix of pride and fear. "I know, sweetheart. Just promise me you'll be careful. This Richard Blackwell isn't a man who forgives easily." The next morning, Emma arrived at work with an uneasy feeling in her stomach. She didn't know what to expect. All morning, she kept watching the restaurant's entrance, waiting for Richard to appear at any moment. But lunchtime came and went, and he never showed. Maybe he changed his mind about coming back, said Ryan, the waiter who'd been humiliated the week before. Or he's plotting revenge, Dorothy murmured, still nervous. It wasn't until late afternoon that Richard Blackwell finally arrived. He wore a flawless grey suit and walked into the restaurant with his usual confident air. Marcus practically ran to greet him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwell. Your table is ready." "Thank you, Marcus. And where's the waitress I requested?" Emma emerged from the kitchen at that moment as if summoned. She approached the table with her notepad in hand, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Good afternoon," she said formally. "Good afternoon, Emma," Richard replied, sitting down. "Sleep well last night?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "I imagine after what you did yesterday, you must have spent the whole night thinking about the consequences." Emma took a deep breath. She wouldn't lie to him. "I did think about it, but I don't regret it." Richard smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Good. Regret is for weak people." He opened the menu and pretended to study it for a few minutes, but Emma could feel his eyes watching her. Finally, he closed it. "I'll have the filet mignon with Madeira sauce, white rice, roasted potatoes, and a mixed salad, and a fresh orange juice." "Any special instructions for the preparation?" "I want you to go to the kitchen yourself and oversee the preparation of my dish." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because then you'll be sure I'm not being rude to anyone in there. Since you've appointed yourself as my behavior supervisor, I want you to do the job properly." The taunt was clear, but Emma decided to take the challenge. "Fine, I'll oversee it." She headed to the kitchen and placed the order with Joe, the head chef. As he prepared the dish, Emma watched through the glass window overlooking the dining room. Richard had taken out his phone and was making calls, but every now and then he glanced toward the kitchen. "Hey, Emma," Joe called her attention. "You know that man out there could ruin your life if he wanted to, right?" "Everyone keeps saying that, Joe, but so far he hasn't done anything." "That's exactly what worries me. When Richard Blackwell wants revenge on someone, he doesn't attack head-on. He chips away little by little until there's nowhere left to run." A shiver ran down Emma's spine, but she said nothing. When the dish was ready, she personally brought it to Richard. "Did you oversee the whole process?" he asked, before taking a bite. "Yes." "And how did the head chef treat you?" "Normally. He prepared your dish without complaining." "What a shame," Richard remarked, cutting into the steak. "I was hoping he'd be rude to me. Then you could have thrown something else in my face." "Are you mocking the situation?" Richard chewed slowly before answering. "I'm doing the opposite. I'm taking it very seriously." He dabbed his mouth with the napkin. "So seriously that I've decided to make you an offer." Emma's stomach tightened. "What kind of offer?" "I want to offer you a job at one of my companies. Salary 3 times what you make here, full health insurance, meal allowance." The offer was too tempting to be true. Emma immediately grew suspicious. "In exchange for what?" "Nothing. I just want to see how you behave when you're on the side of power instead of fighting against it." "And if I refuse?" Richard shrugged. "Life goes on. You keep working here, I keep having lunch here, and we'll see what happens." Emma stayed silent for a few minutes, watching Richard eat calmly. There was something about the situation that didn't add up. "Why weren't you angry yesterday?" she asked suddenly. Richard stopped chewing and looked at her with interest. "That's an interesting question," he said. "Why do you think I wasn't?" "I don't know. Everyone expected you to yell, threaten, make a scene, but you seemed almost amused." "Maybe I was. Amused, I mean." "Why?" Richard finished eating and pushed his plate aside. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked straight into Emma's eyes. "Do you know how old I am, Emma?" 60-something, I imagine." 62. "And do you know how long it's been since anyone dared to stand up to me?" Emma shook her head. "About 40 years, since my father stopped yelling at me." The answer surprised her. Richard Blackwell had never shared anything personal with anyone at the restaurant. "What do you mean?" "My father was exactly like I am today. He yelled at everyone, humiliated employees, thought money gave him the right to treat people poorly." Richard fiddled absently with the napkin. "The difference is, when I was young, I had the courage to stand up to him. We fought so much the neighbors called the police." Emma sat in the chair across from him, forgetting for a moment she was working. What happened? He had a heart attack at 58. We spent the last 2 years of his life not speaking. When he passed, I inherited the businesses and swore I'd be different from him. But I wasn't. Richard laughed bitterly. No, I wasn't. During the first financial crisis I faced, I learned that kindness doesn't pay the bills. Employees started slacking, deadlines were missed, we almost went bankrupt. So I decided my father was right. Fear is more effective than respect. And did it work? For 40 years, yes. The companies grew. The money came in. No one dared question me anymore. He gazed out the window for a moment, until a 20-something waitress threw coffee on my head and reminded me what it felt like to be on the other side. Emma felt a lump in her throat. There was something in Richard's voice she'd never heard before. Not exactly sadness, but a deep weariness. Do you miss your father? Every day, he admitted. But I don't miss the cruel man he became. I miss the father who taught me to ride a bike, who took me fishing on Sundays, who laughed at my bad jokes. And when did he change? When the business started growing, he said he had responsibilities, that he had to be tough to protect the family's future. In the end, he protected the future so much he forgot to live in the present. Emma glanced around the restaurant. A few customers were watching the conversation curiously, but kept a respectful distance. Do you have family? The question made Richard's face harden again. For a moment, Emma thought he wouldn't answer. I have a daughter, he finally said. Rebecca. She's 35. And where is she? In Boston. We haven't spoken in 8 years. His tone made it clear this was a painful subject. Emma sensed she shouldn't push, but her curiosity got the better of her. Why don't you talk? Richard stood abruptly from his chair. Because she decided to stand up to me one day too. Only unlike you, she wasn't lucky enough to catch me on a patient day. He grabbed his wallet and tossed some bills on the table. The job offer still stands, think it over. He left without another word, leaving Emma alone with a whirlwind of thoughts and unanswered questions. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now, continuing. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Richard's words echoed in her head, especially the part about his daughter. She tried to imagine what kind of fight could separate a father from his only child for 8 years. The next day, Richard didn't show up at the restaurant or the day after. Emma grew restless, wondering if she'd said something wrong. Then Dorothy approached her during a quiet moment in the afternoon. Sweetheart, have you heard the news? What news, Dorothy? Richard Blackwell is in the hospital. Seems he fell ill at the company yesterday morning. Emma's heart raced. What happened? No one knows for sure. They say he collapsed during a meeting. The doctors are running tests. Emma spent the rest of the day uneasy, debating whether to visit Richard at the hospital. After all, they barely knew each other, and their relationship was too strange to call a friendship. But there was something about him that deeply intrigued her. When her shift ended, she decided to stop by Mercy Medical Center, where she'd heard Richard was admitted. She managed to find his room number, and after much hesitation went up to the 4th floor. The door was slightly ajar. Emma peeked inside and saw Richard lying in bed, hooked up to machines monitoring his vitals. He looked smaller and frailer without his impeccable suit and intimidating posture. Come in, he said, without taking his eyes off the ceiling. Emma pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the room. How did you know it was me? Your perfume. And because you're the only one crazy enough to visit someone you barely know. She moved closer to the bed and sat in the chair beside it. How are you feeling? Like a 62-year-old man who spent his whole life stressed and never took care of his health. He finally looked at her. The doctor said it was just a spike in blood pressure, nothing serious, but they want to keep me under observation for another day. Thank goodness it wasn't serious. Richard watched her silently for a few minutes. There was something different about him here in the hospital, less intimidating, more human. Why did you come here, Emma? I don't know. When I heard you were sick, I got worried. Worried about someone you think is a monster. You're not a monster, she said, surprising herself. Just someone who lost their way and forgot how to treat others with respect. Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath. My daughter used to say that too. Tell me about her. Why? Because I get the feeling you need to talk to someone about it, and I'm here. Richard stayed silent for so long that Emma thought he'd fallen asleep. Just as she was about to get up and leave, he began to speak. Rebecca was always stubborn, just like me. Even as a child, she questioned everything. Why I yelled at employees, why I never had time for her, why her mother and I fought so much. Did you divorce? When Rebecca was 15, my ex-wife, Catherine, couldn't take my temper anymore. She took our daughter and moved in with her mother. I paid child support, visited on weekends, but I was never really there for her. Emma listened quietly, seeing a side of Richard she never imagined existed. And what happened 8 years ago? Richard opened his eyes and looked straight at her. Rebecca was engaged. She'd graduated with a teaching degree and was planning the wedding. Her fiancé Andrew was a simple guy, worked as a teacher at a public school. Good kid, but in my opinion, he didn't have enough ambition for my daughter. You didn't approve of the marriage? Worse than that, I made sure she knew exactly what I thought of Andrew, told her he'd keep her poor for the rest of her life, that she deserved someone better, someone who could give her a comfortable life. And how did she react? Defended him, of course, said love was more important than money, that they'd be happy together. Typical romantic young woman. Richard shook his head. Then I did something terrible. Emma felt a tightness in her chest, dreading what would come next. What did you do? I made Andrew an offer. $100,000 to break off the relationship and leave my daughter's life. Told him if he really loved her, he wouldn't want to condemn her to a life of financial struggle. And he accepted? At first, no. Andrew was a decent kid. He was offended by the offer. But I kept pushing, raised it to $200,000, then $300,000. I talked about all the things Rebecca would have to give up if she married him, about the kids who wouldn't go to the best schools, about the modest house she'd have to live in. Emma felt sick imagining the pressure that young teacher must have felt. In the end, did he take the money? Richard nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He did. And Rebecca found out. I don't know how, but she did. Showed up at my house one Sunday morning, screaming, crying, calling me every name in the book. And what did you say to her? That I was protecting her. If Andrew truly loved her, he wouldn't have taken the money, that I had proven he was no good. How did she react? She looked at me as if I were the devil himself, said I'd destroyed the only good thing she had in her life, that I was exactly like my father, a bitter man who couldn't stand to see others happy. Richard stopped speaking, wiping the tears that had begun to stream down his face. Emma felt the urge to take his hand, but wasn't sure if it would be appropriate. Was that the last conversation you had? Not exactly. She said one more thing before leaving. Richard sighed deeply. She said I was so busy protecting her from the world that I forgot to protect her from myself, and that from that day on, I was lost to her forever. What about Andrew? What happened to him? He left town with the money. Later, I heard he used part of it to finish law school. He'd been studying in his spare time. Now he's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., married, 2 kids. And Rebecca? She moved too. Went to Boston, works as the principal of a private school. Married another teacher 3 years ago. Even changed her last name, no longer Blackwell. Now she's Rebecca Wilson. Emma fell silent, absorbing everything she'd heard. Richard's story was far more complicated than she'd imagined. Have you ever tried reaching out to her? A few times. Sent flowers on her birthday, Christmas cards. She never responded. Once I called the school where she works, but when she realized it was me, she hung up. Have you ever thought of going to Boston in person? I think about it every day, but I'm afraid of rejection, and I'm afraid she might be right about me. Richard looked at Emma. Maybe I really am like my father. Maybe it's too late to change. It's never too late. You're 24, Emma. Your whole life is ahead of you. For me, most of it is already gone. But the part that's left could still be different. Richard smiled sadly. You're very optimistic for someone who spends all day serving rude people. Maybe because I learned from my father that it's always worth fighting for what's right, even when it seems impossible. Your father sounds like a good man. He was. He'd say you still have time to make things right with your daughter. Richard closed his eyes again. Emma sat there for a few more minutes, listening only to the hum of the medical equipment. When she stood to leave, he opened his eyes. Emma? Yes? Thank you for coming. Of course. And about that job offer, it still stands. I'll think about it. When she left Mercy Medical Center, Emma's mind was swirling with conflicting thoughts. Richard Blackwell wasn't the terrible man she'd imagined, just a wounded person who'd lost his way. But that didn't excuse how he treated others. The next day, Richard returned to the restaurant. He seemed more worn down than usual, but his intimidating demeanor remained. Emma served him as usual, making no mention of the hospital visit. He didn't bring it up either, yet something had shifted between them. Richard wasn't rude to any of the staff that day, and when Dorothy tripped and spilled a glass of water near his table, instead of yelling, he simply called Marcus over and asked someone to clean it up. "It's all right, Dorothy," he said to the elderly woman who was clearly nervous. "Accidents happen." Dorothy stared at him as if she'd seen a ghost. Then she glanced at Emma, who shrugged, pretending not to understand what was happening. In the days that followed, Richard remained polite but distant. He would arrive, have lunch, chat politely with Emma about superficial topics, and then leave. No shouting, no humiliation, but also none of the closeness that had emerged during their conversation at the hospital. It was on a Tuesday the following week that everything changed again. Emma was serving other tables when she overheard a heated argument coming from Richard's table. As she approached, she saw he was on the phone, and his tone had reverted to its usual sharpness. "I don't want to hear excuses," he yelled into the phone. "The deadline was today, and the project isn't finished. If you can't deliver what you promised, I'll find someone who can." Emma moved closer discreetly, pretending to wipe down a nearby table. Richard kept shouting for several more minutes, threatening to fire people and cancel contracts. When he finally hung up, his face was twisted in fury. "Incompetent fools," he muttered, slamming his phone onto the table. "Work troubles?" Emma asked, stepping closer. Richard looked at her as if suddenly remembering where he was. "Nothing you need to worry about," he replied, though his voice was still tense. "You were shouting so loudly everyone here heard you." "That's hardly nothing." Richard glanced around and noticed other customers watching. His face flushed, but this time it seemed to be from embarrassment, not anger. It was a moment of stress. It happens. Of course it happens. But does it have to happen by yelling at people who can't defend themselves? Emma, you don't understand how the business world works. Sometimes you have to be firm. Firm is different from rude. Richard stared at her for a few seconds, and Emma saw the same conflicted expression he'd had at the hospital, as if he were fighting something inside himself. "You're right," he finally said. "I shouldn't have yelled like that." "Not at me. At the person on the other end of the call." "What do you mean?" "Call them back and apologize." Richard laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You're joking, right? I'm the boss. I don't apologize to employees." "And that's exactly why your daughter doesn't speak to you anymore," Emma blurted out before she could stop herself. Richard paled, and for a moment she thought he might explode in anger. Instead, he just looked at her with deep sadness. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do. You told me yourself. Rebecca pulled away because you can't treat people with respect, and now you're doing the same thing all over again." Richard picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a long time. Emma could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression. "If I call back and apologize, will you accept the job offer?" The question caught her completely off guard. "What?" "You heard me. If I call the engineer in charge of the project and apologize for how I spoke, will you agree to work for me?" Emma didn't know how to respond. It was an odd bargain, but maybe the only way to get Richard to change his behavior. "Why is this so important to you?" "Because..." Richard hesitated. "Because maybe you're right. Maybe I need someone like you around to remind me how to act decently. I don't want to be an adult babysitter." "That's not it. It's..." He searched for the right words. You make me remember who I used to be before I became this. Emma studied Richard and saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability. If you call and apologize, I'll agree to work for you on a trial basis. 3 months. If it works out, we'll continue. If it doesn't work out, we each go our separate ways. Richard nodded and dialed a number on his phone. Emma stood there motionless, watching as he waited for someone to answer on the other end. Andrew, it's Richard Blackwell. Look, I'm calling to apologize for how I spoke to you earlier. I know you're doing your best with the project, and it wasn't fair of me to yell like that. Yes, I understand there were issues with the material supplier. No, you don't need to work over the weekend to make up for it. Monday is fine. Thank you for understanding. When he hung up, Richard looked at Emma with an expression that mixed pride and embarrassment. There. Are you satisfied? It's a start, she replied. When do I begin working? Next Monday. I'll have someone pick you up to show you the office. Emma nodded, still not quite believing what was happening. And what exactly will my role be? Richard smiled, and this time, it was genuine. I'm still figuring that out, but I'm sure you'll find something useful to do. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, back to the story. The following Saturday, Emma was at home organizing her clothes for her new professional chapter when she received a call from an unknown number. Hello? Emma, it's Richard. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from Marcus. No, it's fine. Did something happen? Actually, yes. I was wondering if you had any plans this afternoon. Emma glanced around her small apartment. She had planned to spend the day cleaning and organizing, nothing too important. Nothing planned. Why? I'd like you to come with me somewhere. It's work-related, but it's also personal. The vagueness of his explanation piqued her curiosity. What kind of place? You'll understand when we get there. Can I pick you up in an hour? Against her better judgment, Emma agreed. Richard arrived promptly, driving a modest black car instead of the Cadillac she had expected. During the drive, he was quieter than usual, answering her questions with monosyllables. They drove for about 40 minutes before reaching a middle-class residential neighborhood on Chicago's east side. Richard parked the car in front of a cemetery and turned off the engine. We're here, he said simply. Emma looked around, confused. What are we doing here? Richard took a deep breath before answering. Visiting my father. They got out of the car and walked silently through the cemetery aisles. Richard seemed to know the way by heart. They stopped in front of a simple grave with a black granite headstone that read, William Blackwell Sr., 1935-1995, father and businessman. Richard stood there for several minutes, just staring at the headstone. Emma respected the silence, unsure of her role in the moment. It's been 29 years since he passed, Richard finally said, and this is the first time I've come here to talk to him. You've never visited your father's grave before? I've visited many times, but always to argue, always to tell him how much I hated him for what he made me become. Richard knelt beside the headstone. Today I came to apologize. Emma felt a lump in her throat, realizing she was witnessing something deeply intimate and painful. Hi, Dad, Richard began, his voice slightly unsteady. I brought a friend for you to meet. This is Emma, the brave waitress I'd tell you about if you were still here. He glanced at Emma, who stepped closer and knelt beside the grave. Dad, I know I was never a good son. I spent years hating you, blaming you for all my flaws. But now I understand you were doing the best you could with the knowledge you had at the time. Tears began to stream down Richard's face, and Emma had to force herself not to cry too. I became exactly like you, and for the longest time I was proud of it. I thought I was honoring your memory by being a ruthless, hard-nosed businessman, but I lost my daughter in the process, Dad. I lost Rebecca because I didn't know how to show love in a healthy way. Richard fell silent for a few minutes, trying to compose himself. Emma made me realize it's not too late to change, that I don't have to be cruel to earn respect. And I wanted you to know that I forgive you, Dad. I forgive you for all the yelling, all the humiliation, all the coldness. And I hope you can forgive me for holding on to so much resentment for so many years." He slowly stood up and wiped the tears from his face. "Emma, there's something I haven't told you yet." "What?" "On Monday, we're not just going to my office. We're going to Boston." Emma's heart raced. "To see your daughter? To try. I called the school where she works and set up a meeting. I told them it was about a possible donation for educational projects. She doesn't know it's me." "Do you really think that's a good idea, lying to her like that?" "I don't know. But it's the only way I could think of to get her to give me even 5 minutes of her time." Emma grew worried. This could go very wrong. "And what's my role in all this?" "I want you to come with me, to help me say the right things, to stop me from ruining everything if I lose my temper. Richard, this isn't a good idea. If your daughter finds out she was tricked, she'll be even angrier. I know, but I've run out of other options. This is my last chance to win my daughter back." Emma looked at Richard's father's grave, trying to imagine what advice he would give in this situation. "Promise me one thing." "What?" "If she asks you to leave, you'll respect that. You won't push, you won't make a scene, you won't force things." Richard hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I promise. And if she agrees to talk, you'll be completely honest about everything, about the mistakes you made, about Andrew, about how much you miss her." "I promise that too." They returned to the car in silence. On the drive back, Emma kept thinking about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. Her life had completely changed since the day she'd poured coffee on Richard Blackwell's head. And now she was about to get even more deeply involved in his personal life. When they arrived at her apartment, Richard turned off the engine but made no move to get out. "Emma, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you agree to help me? After everything you've seen, why didn't you give up on me?" Emma thought for a moment before answering. "Because my dad always taught me that everyone deserves a second chance. And because I saw in your eyes that day at Mercy Medical Center that you truly wanted to change. What if I disappoint you? Then you'll have to live with the guilt. But I'd rather try and fail than never try at all." Richard smiled sadly. "Your daughter is lucky to have a mother who raised someone like you. And your daughter was lucky to have a father who, even after making so many mistakes, still has time to make things right." On Monday morning, Richard picked Emma up at 6. They had an 8 o'clock flight to Boston. On the way to the airport, both were nervous and quiet. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Emma asked as they waited at the gate. "No," Richard answered honestly, "but I know I have to." The flight to Boston lasted just an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Richard nervously flipped through a magazine without actually reading anything. Emma gazed at the clouds through the window, wondering what the reunion between father and daughter would be like after 8 years. When they arrived in Boston, they took a taxi to the school where Rebecca worked. It was a private institution in an upscale neighborhood with a modern, well-kept facade. Richard stopped in front of the gate and stared at the building for several minutes. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to Emma. "How are you feeling?" "Like running away," he admitted, but also more afraid of not trying than of trying and failing. They entered the school and introduced themselves at the reception. The secretary, a friendly woman in her 50s, attended to them promptly. "You have a meeting scheduled with Principal Rebecca, right?" "She's waiting for you in her office." Richard and Emma climbed the stairs to the second floor. When they reached the principal's door, Richard stopped abruptly. "I can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. "Yes, you can." Emma held his arm. "Remember what we talked about at the cemetery. Your daughter deserves to know you've changed." Richard took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and waited. "Come in," came a woman's voice from inside. They opened the door and stepped into the office. Rebecca Wilson sat behind a desk, reviewing some papers. When she looked up to see who had arrived, her face turned completely pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked, standing abruptly. Rebecca was a beautiful woman, with brown hair tied in a bun and elegant yet understated clothes. Emma could see the resemblance to Richard in her eyes and the shape of her face. "Hi, Rebecca," Richard said, his voice faltering. "You look lovely." I asked you a question. What are you doing at my school? I wanted to talk to you. I knew you wouldn't answer if I asked normally, so you lied to get in here, Rebecca interrupted, her voice full of anger. Typical of you, always manipulating situations to get what you want. Rebecca, please, no, you don't get to show up here after 8 years and think you can just talk to me like nothing happened. Emma saw the situation escalating quickly and decided to step in. Excuse me, she said, stepping forward. My name is Emma. I work with your father. Rebecca looked at her suspiciously. And what does that have to do with me? I asked him to come here, Emma lied, because I thought you two needed to talk. You don't know me, young lady. You have no idea what this man is capable of. Actually, I do. Your father told me about Andrew, about the money, about everything. The mention of her ex-fiancé made Rebecca's face harden even more. He told you? And what was his version of the story? Emma glanced at Richard, who nodded for her to continue, that he made a terrible mistake, that he destroyed his own daughter's happiness because he thought he was protecting her, and that he's regretted it every day for the last 8 years. Regret doesn't change what happened, Rebecca said, though some of the initial anger had faded from her voice. It doesn't, Richard agreed, finding the courage to speak. But I want you to know I understand now how wrong I was, and I want to ask for your forgiveness. Rebecca looked at him with an expression mixing surprise and skepticism. Forgiveness? After 8 years, you show up here thinking an apology will fix everything? I don't think it will fix everything, but I hope it's a start. Rebecca sat back down, running her hands through her hair. You ruined my life, Dad. You destroyed the man I loved and made me question every relationship I've had since. I know, and I can't undo that, but I can try to be different from now on. What do you mean? Richard looked at Emma, who encouraged him with her eyes to continue. I've changed, Rebecca, or at least I'm trying to. I stopped yelling at employees. I'm learning to treat people with respect. And it all started when a brave waitress poured coffee on my head to defend me from myself. Despite the tension, Rebecca couldn't suppress a small smile. She poured coffee on you? Very hot coffee, Richard confirmed, smiling too. And it was the best thing that's happened to me in the last 20 years. Rebecca looked at Emma with renewed interest. Why did you do that? Because I saw him humiliating an elderly woman at the restaurant where I worked, and I couldn't stay quiet watching that. And now you work together. It's complicated, Emma replied. But your father is really trying. I've seen him changing little by little, apologizing when he's wrong, treating people better. Rebecca fell silent for a few minutes, clearly processing everything she was hearing. Why now, Dad? Why did you decide to change now? Because I realized I was repeating my own father's mistakes, and because I realized I could leave this life without ever speaking to you again. And that terrifies me. You should have thought about that before. I should have, yes, but I didn't. And now all I can do is try to be better from now on. Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the schoolyard where some children were playing. You know I got married? I do. To a teacher. Matthew. He teaches history. A good man, patient, who loves me just as I am. She turned back to Richard. Do you know why it took me 3 years to accept his proposal? Richard shook his head. Because every time he asked me to marry him, I kept wondering if you'd show up again to ruin everything. I kept imagining what kind of offer you'd make him to get him to leave me. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Rebecca, I needed therapy, Dad. Years of therapy to learn to trust someone again, to believe that not all men were as greedy as Andrew. And Andrew, did you ever talk to him after? Once, by chance, a few years ago. He apologized, said he was desperate back then because his mother needed an expensive surgery and he had no money. Said he thought he could use the money to pay for the surgery and then come back to me. Richard felt even worse. And you forgave him? I understood his circumstances, if that's what you're asking. But I didn't forgive you, because you created that whole situation. You were the one who put a desperate young man in an impossible position. I know. And if I could turn back time... But you can't, Rebecca interrupted. So the question is, what do you plan to do now? Richard looked at Emma, then back at his daughter. I want to earn back your love. I want to be the father you deserve to have. I want to meet your husband. I want to be part of your life again. And you think it's that simple? No, I think it'll be the hardest work of my life, but also the most important. Rebecca sat back down and studied Richard for a long time. Emma could feel the tension in the air, as if the entire future of their family depended on the next words spoken. I need time to think, Rebecca finally said. How much time? I don't know, maybe weeks, maybe months. I can't just pretend the last 8 years didn't happen. Richard nodded, visibly disappointed, but trying to hide it. I understand. But, Rebecca continued, and Richard's heart nearly stopped. I'm willing to try, slowly, no rush, but willing to try. Richard felt tears filling his eyes. Really? Really. But with conditions. Any conditions. First condition, no expensive gifts, no trying to buy my forgiveness with money. Accepted. Second condition, you will meet my husband and you will treat him with respect. No comments about his profession, no insinuations about money, nothing. Accepted. Third condition, if I ask for space, you will respect it. If I say I'm not ready for something, you will accept it without argument. Accepted. Rebecca looked at Emma. And fourth condition, I want your friend here to keep working with you, because I have a feeling she's the only person who can keep you in line. Emma was surprised by the condition. I don't know if... Accepted. Richard hurried to respond. Emma is the best thing that's happened to my company and my life in years. Rebecca smiled for the first time since they had arrived. Then it's settled. We'll try to rebuild our relationship. Richard stood up from his chair and for a moment seemed like he might step forward to hug his daughter. But then he held back and simply extended his hand. Thank you, my dear, for giving me this chance. Rebecca shook her father's hand, but without the warmth that once existed between them. Don't disappoint me again, Dad, because there won't be a third chance. I won't disappoint you, I promise. They said their goodbyes and left the school. During the ride back to the airport, Richard stayed silent, clearly emotional but trying to process everything that had happened. How are you feeling? Emma asked as they waited for their flight back to Chicago. Relieved, scared, hopeful. All at once, Richard replied, and very grateful you convinced me to do this. Honestly, the decision was all yours. I just helped you find the courage. Still, thank you for everything. On the flight back, Richard began making plans. I'll send her flowers every week. No, that's an expensive gift. She won't like it. I'll send letters instead. No, that's pushing it. Richard, Emma interrupted. Relax. She said she'll try, and that's already a big step. Now you need to be patient and let things happen naturally. You're right, it's just, I'm so eager to make up for lost time. And that's exactly the eagerness that could ruin everything. Rebecca needs time to trust you again. Richard nodded and tried to calm himself. When they landed in Chicago, he insisted on taking Emma out to dinner to celebrate. Celebrate what? She asked. The first step toward getting my daughter back, and the first day of our official professional partnership. During dinner, Richard was more relaxed and happy than Emma had ever seen him. He shared stories about Rebecca as a child, how stubborn she'd been even then, and the outings they used to take before business consumed his life. She'll like you, he told Emma. You're alike, brave, determined, unwilling to accept injustice. I hope so. She seems like a very special person. She is. And I almost lost her forever because of my own stupidity. The following Tuesday, Emma officially started working at Richard's company. Her office was on the top floor of a commercial building in downtown Chicago, with a panoramic view of the city. It was a far cry from the restaurant where she'd worked before. Richard introduced her to the staff as a special HR consultant, which drew many curious looks. After all, everyone knew how Richard handled personnel matters, and no one quite understood what Emma's role would be. She soon found out. Her main responsibility was to be present in Richard's meetings and step in whenever he started losing his temper or treating someone poorly. It was an unusual job, but a necessary one. In the first week, she had to step in 3 times. Once when Richard started yelling at a supplier who was late with a delivery, another when he nearly humiliated an intern who had made a mistake, and a third when he got irritated with a client who was being too demanding. "You're like my external conscience," he remarked at the end of the week. "That's one way to look at it," Emma replied. "But the goal is for you to develop your own internal conscience so you won't need me anymore." "And when will that happen?" "When you can control yourself on your own. When treating people well becomes automatic, not something you have to remind yourself to do." In the following weeks, Richard began showing real signs of improvement. He caught himself a few times on the verge of losing his temper and managed to control it without Emma having to intervene. He also started praising employees when they did good work, something he'd never done before. The company's employees were initially suspicious of the changes. Many thought it was just a phase and that Richard would soon revert to his old behavior. But as the weeks passed and the changes held, the workplace atmosphere visibly improved. "Boss, can I ask you something?" said Melissa, Richard's secretary, one day. "Of course. Are you okay? I mean, you're not sick or anything, right?" Richard laughed at the question. "Why do you ask?" "It's just that you've been different, more polite. The staff's been talking." "And what are they saying?" "That maybe you're planning to sell the company and that's why you're being so nice to everyone." Richard glanced at Emma, who tried to hide her smile. "They can relax, Melissa. I'm not selling the company. I'm just trying to be a better person." "Oh, good, we were worried." Melissa went back to work, clearly relieved. During this time, Richard kept in sporadic contact with Rebecca. They exchanged text messages now and then. Nothing too deep, just small talk about daily life. It was slow progress, but it was progress. One day, Richard got a message that thrilled him. "Dad, Matthew is curious to meet you. How about lunch next weekend?" "She wants to introduce me to her husband," Richard told Emma, excited as a child. "That's a big step," Emma agreed. "But remember the conditions she set. I'll be an angel. I swear I'll be the most polite, respectful father-in-law ever. Just don't overdo it in the opposite direction. Be natural." The following Saturday, Richard traveled to Boston again, this time alone. He'd invited Emma to come along, but she thought it was better to let the family have a private moment. Lunch took place at a simple restaurant near Rebecca's home. Matthew Wilson was a pleasant man in his 40s, with a well-groomed beard and a calm way of speaking. Richard was nervous at first, but managed to keep the conversation polite. "Rebecca told me you've changed a lot lately," Matthew commented during lunch. "I'm trying. It's a difficult but necessary process," Richard replied, "and I apologize for the problems I caused in the past." "You don't owe me an apology, but I appreciate it." "Matthew teaches high school history," Rebecca said, watching her father's reaction. Richard felt the urge to comment on the profession, about salary, financial future, but he held back. "That must be a rewarding job," he said simply. "It is," Matthew replied, surprised. "I love working with young people, helping them understand the world they live in." "And how did you two meet?" "At a university extension course," Rebecca answered. "He was specializing in education, and I was taking a course on school management." Richard listened to the couple's stories with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and showing respect for the life they had built together. By the end of lunch, both Rebecca and Matthew seemed more at ease. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Blackwell," Matthew said as they said goodbye. "The pleasure was mine, Matthew. I hope we can see each other again soon." As Richard was leaving, Rebecca walked him to the car. "You did well today, Dad," she said. "Really? Really? Matthew liked you. He said you weren't the terrible man I'd described." Richard smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "Does that mean I'm on the right track? It means it's worth keeping at it." In the following months, Richard and Rebecca's relationship slowly mended. They began talking more regularly on the phone, and Richard made a few more trips to Boston to visit his daughter and son-in-law. Meanwhile, Richard's transformation at work continued to progress. His company became known in town as one of the best places to work, with satisfied employees and a respectful environment. Productivity rose, deadlines were met more consistently, and even clients began noticing the difference in service. "You know what's most interesting?" Emma remarked to Richard one day. "You're making more money now than before when you were rude to everyone." "How so?" "The employees are more motivated, so they produce more. Clients are happier with the service, so they recommend the company to others. And you don't waste time hiring new people because no one quits anymore." Richard thought about it. It was true. Being a better person was paying off, even financially. "Who knew kindness could be good for business?" he joked. "Your father never learned that in time. But you did." It was on a Thursday in December when Richard got a call that would change everything again. "Dad?" It was Rebecca's voice, but she sounded like she was crying. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" I have to tell you something. I'm pregnant." Richard's world stopped. He was going to be a grandfather. "Really?" he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Really? I'm 3 months along. Matthew and I wanted to be sure everything was okay before telling anyone." "Rebecca, this is the best news I could ever hear. Congratulations, my dear. Truly." "Dad?" "Yes? I want you to be part of your grandchild's life. Whether it's a boy or a girl, I want you to be the loving grandfather I know you can be." Richard started crying right there in the office, in front of Emma and all the employees passing by. "I'll be the best grandfather in the world, I promise." "I know you will, because you've already proven you can change when you want to." That evening, Richard took Emma and Ellen to dinner at one of the city's finest restaurants to celebrate. Throughout the meal, he couldn't stop talking about his plans for the grandchild on the way. "I'll teach them to ride a bike, to swim, to play soccer," he said excitedly. "What if it's a girl?" Ellen asked, amused. "I'll teach her all that too. And a few things I didn't teach Rebecca properly because I was always busy with work." Emma watched Richard fondly. In less than a year, he had gone from a feared, lonely businessman to a man eager to be a grandfather and reconnect with his family. "Richard, can I ask you a personal question?" she said. "Of course." "Are you happy?" Richard stopped talking and took a moment to consider the question. "You know, Emma, I can't remember the last time I was truly happy before these past few months. I think it was when Rebecca was just a little girl and we'd go to the park on Sundays. That must have been about 25 years ago. And now? Now I wake up every day hoping something good will happen, hoping for a call from Rebecca, hoping to solve a work problem by talking instead of shouting, hoping to see you argue with some rude employee." He laughed. "It's a strange feeling, but a very good one." "That's wonderful, Richard. You deserve to be happy. And so do you, Emma. In fact, I have a proposal for you." "Another proposal?" she laughed. "The last one worked out so well. I want you to become a partner in the company." Emma nearly choked on her wine. "What?" "You heard me. I want you as my partner, 30% of the company. You've had a more positive impact here than anyone I've ever worked with." "Richard, this is crazy. I don't even have business experience." "But you have something far more valuable, integrity, and the ability to bring out the best in people." Ellen had been watching the conversation with wide eyes. 30% of Richard Blackwell's company was worth millions. "Son, are you sure about this?" she asked. "Absolutely. Emma saved my company, my relationship with my daughter, and probably my life. 30% is less than she deserves." Emma fell silent for several minutes, processing the offer. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but don't take too long. The sooner we make it official, the better for everyone." 2 weeks later, Emma accepted the proposal and became Richard's partner. The news sent shockwaves through Chicago's business community. No one could understand how a former 24-year-old waitress had become a partner to one of the region's most successful entrepreneurs. But to those who knew the whole story, it made perfect sense. The following March, Peter was born, Richard's first grandchild. The businessman, once feared for his cold demeanor, wept like a child when he held the baby for the first time. "Hi, my little grandson," he whispered to Peter. "Grandpa promises it'll be different with you. I'll be loving, I'll have time, I'll teach you only good things. Rebecca watched the scene with tears in her eyes. The man cradling her son with such care and love was nothing like the distant, cold father she'd known as a child. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "For what?" "For changing. For becoming the person I always knew was inside you. Thank you for not giving up on me completely." At that moment, with his grandson in his arms and his daughter smiling beside him, Richard felt his transformation was complete. He'd broken the cycle of coldness and fear that had plagued his family for generations. 6 months later, at Emma Sullivan Parker's 25th birthday party, Richard gave a toast that moved everyone present. "A year and a half ago, I was a bitter, lonely, cruel man. I treated everyone around me poorly and thought it made me strong, until a brave waitress threw coffee on my head and showed me how wrong I was about everything." Everyone laughed, remembering the story that had become legendary in the city. "Emma didn't just change how I see the world. She gave me back my daughter, blessed me with a wonderful grandson, saved my company, and taught me it's never too late to be a better person." He raised his champagne glass. "So this toast is to Emma Sullivan Parker, the bravest woman I know, and to proof that sometimes one simple act of courage can transform entire lives. Cheers!" everyone shouted, raising their glasses. Emma had tears in her eyes, moved by Richard's words and all they'd achieved together. "Thank you, Richard, for giving me the chance to be part of this transformation. Thank you for having the courage to stand up to me when no one else would. And now, what's the plan?" Richard smiled and looked around the party, taking in all the loved ones gathered. Rebecca and Matthew chatting with Ellen, little Peter sleeping peacefully in his stroller, the company employees enjoying themselves, all united as one big family he never thought possible. "Now we keep building. We'll grow our company the right way, treating our employees and clients well. I'll be the best grandfather I can be to Peter, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving people can change when they find enough motivation." "And what was your motivation?" Richard looked straight into Emma's eyes. "You. And the realization that I didn't want to be remembered just as a rich, cruel man. I wanted to leave a better legacy than that." The party lasted late into the night, filled with laughter, music, and stories. It was the kind of celebration Richard had never imagined having in his life. Not for lack of money to throw an expensive party, but for lack of people who truly cared about him. Now, at 63, he'd finally learned the difference between respect based on fear and respect based on affection. And he'd discovered the latter was infinitely more rewarding. When everyone had left and Richard was cleaning up, Emma approached him. "Richard?" "Yes." "Do you know the moment I realized you'd truly changed?" "When was it?" "The day you called that engineer back to apologize. Right then, I saw you were willing to swallow your pride to be a better person." "And do you know the moment I realized I needed to change?" "When?" "When you threw that coffee on my head and didn't show an ounce of fear toward me. That's when I understood the fear I inspired in people wasn't real power, just a pathetic illusion." They laughed, remembering the moment that had changed everything. "Who knew a pitcher of coffee could transform 2 lives, huh?" Emma remarked. 3 lives, don't forget Rebecca. And Peter, too. He'll grow up with a loving grandfather who knows how to show affection. True, 4 lives changed because of one brave waitress. Richard gazed out the window of Emma's apartment at the glittering lights of Chicago below. It was the same city where he'd spent his whole life, but now it felt different, warmer, full of possibilities. "Emma?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. Don't mention it. But remember, the change was all yours. I just threw coffee on your head. The rest you did yourself." Richard laughed again. "Best coffee I ever had." 2 years later, Richard and Emma's company had become the largest construction firm in the state, known not just for its quality work, but for the respectful treatment of employees, suppliers, and clients. Richard had become a mentor to other business owners looking to improve workplace environments, even giving talks at business schools about his transformation. The question I get most is, "How did you change after so long being a cruel person?" he'd say in his speeches. My answer is always the same. I found someone brave enough to hold up a mirror and show me who I really was. Rebecca had given birth to a girl, Sophia, who became her grandfather's greatest joy. Richard spent every weekend in Boston, playing with his grandchildren and helping Matthew and Rebecca with the kids. "Dad's a completely different man," Rebecca told Emma during a visit to Chicago. "Sometimes I look at him playing with Peter and Sophia and can't believe it's the same person who caused me so much pain." "People can change when they find enough motivation," Emma replied. "And you and the kids were the best motivation he could have had." "You were too. Without you, none of this would have happened." Emma and Ellen had moved to a larger house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Ellen had retired early thanks to her daughter's financial success and now devoted her time to volunteer work at hospitals. "Sweetheart, sometimes I can't believe how much our lives have changed," Ellen said one morning as they had coffee together. "I know, Mom. Who would have thought throwing coffee at a rude businessman's head would lead to all this? Your father would be so proud of you." "I think so too. He always said injustice isn't fought by staying silent." "And you proved him right." On a Thursday morning, 4 years after the coffee incident, Richard was in his office reviewing contracts when he received an unexpected call. "Richard Blackwell?" "Yes, who's speaking?" "This is Andrew Davis. I don't know if you remember me." Richard nearly dropped the phone. "Andrew, Rebecca's ex-fiancé." "Of course I remember you, Andrew. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. Mr. Blackwell, I'm calling because, well, this is a bit awkward, but I wanted to talk to you." "Of course. About what?" "I heard you've changed a lot these past few years, that you reconciled with Rebecca, that you've become a more humane businessman. Is it true?" "It is. I've learned from past mistakes, and I'm trying to be a better person." "That's good." "Actually, I wanted to apologize." Richard was confused. "Apologize for what?" "For taking that money, for hurting Rebecca. I know you were trying to protect your daughter the way you thought was right, but I was the man who should have faced the situation with dignity." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Andrew, I'm the one who should apologize. I put you in an impossible situation. I used my power to manipulate both of you. Still, I could have acted differently." "So could I." "Actually, Andrew, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you calling me now after all this time?" Andrew was silent for a moment. "Because I got married last year, and my wife is pregnant. And every time I imagine someone doing to my daughter what I did to Rebecca, it makes me sick. I understand. I wanted you to know I regret it every day, and I'm glad you two reconciled. Rebecca deserved to have her father back. Thank you, Andrew. And congratulations on the marriage and the baby." "Thank you." "And Mr. Blackwell?" "Yes?" "Can you tell me how you managed to change? Because sometimes I catch myself repeating my own father's behaviors, and I want to break that cycle before my daughter is born." Richard smiled. Another life that could be transformed. "Do you have time for a long talk?" "All the time in the world." Richard spent the next hour telling Andrew the whole story of his transformation, from the day Emma threw coffee on him to the present. By the end, Andrew was emotional. What an incredible story. That Emma must be a very special person. "She's the most special person I know. Without her, I'd have spent the rest of my life alone and bitter. Could I meet her someday? I'd like to thank her in person." "Of course. In fact, how about you and your wife coming to Chicago for a weekend? You could meet everyone and hear our whole story." "That would be wonderful." 2 weeks later, Andrew and his wife, Caitlin, visited Chicago. It was an emotional weekend filled with tears, forgiveness, and shared stories. "Richard, I wanted you to know something," Andrew said on the last day of his visit. "Despite everything that happened, I don't hold any grudges. Back then, that money saved my mother's life. She was able to have the surgery and lived 6 more happy years. In a way, you helped me when I needed it most." Richard was moved by the revelation. "I didn't know that part of the story, and I wanted you to know that I still use some of that money today to help other young people in tough situations. I started a small foundation that provides scholarships. It's my way of turning something bad into something good. Andrew, you're an incredible person. Rebecca was lucky to have met you, even if things didn't work out back then. And she was even luckier to have a father who knew how to admit his mistakes and change. Not everyone can do that. That night, after Andrew and Caitlin returned to Washington, D.C., Richard was at home reflecting on everything that had happened when he received a message from Rebecca. "Dad, Andrew called and told me about your meeting. I'm proud of you, for apologizing, for listening to his stories, for becoming the man I always knew you could be. Love you." Richard read the message over and over, tears in his eyes. A few years ago, receiving a message saying "love you" from his daughter seemed impossible. Now it was part of his routine. He called Emma. "Hi Richard, everything okay?" "Better than okay. I wanted to tell you about my conversation with Andrew." Richard told Emma everything, and she was touched by the story. "You know what this means?" she said at the end. "What?" "It means your transformation is creating positive ripples. Andrew wants to be a better father. You've become a better businessman. Rebecca got her dad back. Peter and Sophia will grow up with a loving grandfather. It's like a chain of good. And it all started with you throwing coffee on my head." "No, it all started with you deciding you wanted to change." Richard smiled. "Emma?" "Yes? Thank you. Again." "You're welcome. Again." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave a sincere comment. Do you believe Richard made the right choices to win back his daughter? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.